Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really complex and difficult topic using a specific source.
That's right. We're looking at the early life and the radicalization path of Eric Rudolph.
The domestic terrorist behind those bombings back in the late 90s.
Yeah. And our source today, it's this detailed report focusing just on his life before the violence. So from his birth in '66 up to that point.
Think of it as like the origin story, but based entirely on this report's findings. The goal here isn't to focus on the attacks themselves.
No, not at all. It's about understanding the process. How does someone get to that point? What influences were at play?
Exactly. The report looks at this mix of early life stuff, ideological influences, personal issues, all the things that it says built up over time.
And right off the bat, the report stresses this wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Right. It connects Rudolph's path to that whole rise of far-right extremism in the U.S. in the 90s. It mentions things like Ruby Ridge, Waco.
Yeah, and the Brady Bill. The report calls it this toxic mix: guns standing up to federal agents, religion.
All feeding this kind of anti-government hysteria.
Exactly. So the report frames Rudolph's radicalization as maybe an extreme example, but part of that wider picture. And it really emphasizes it was a process, not instant.
Okay, so let's dive into that process, starting where the report does his childhood. Where were these seeds sown? He was born September 19th, 1966, Merritt Island, Florida.
And a really key turning point the report flags is when his father, Robert Rudolph, died of cancer. Eric was only 15. That was 1981.
15 is tough. And the report says Eric had a specific take on that.
Yeah, this is crucial. He apparently blamed the FDA, thought they failed to approve some medicine that could have saved his dad. The report sees this as a major emotional trigger, a personal grievance.
Wow. Okay. And then shortly after, the family moves.
Right. In 1982, they relocate to this really isolated spot in Nantahala, North Carolina. The report highlights this move as significant, more insular, and his mother, Patricia, becomes a really dominant influence.
Tell us about that family environment, according to the report.
Well, his mother, Patricia, she'd been Catholic but got really into survivalism, and she pushed that onto the kids. The report calls her views fairly extreme.
Living off the grid, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Raising animals, gardening, trying to be self-sufficient. The report links this directly to a deep suspicion of the government. Eric, by the way, only did 9th grade there, then dropped out to work as a carpenter.
And you can already see, can't you, how that background suspicion of government survival skills would play out later.
Absolutely. That self-sufficiency, the comfort with isolation, it all connects to how he evaded capture for so long. The report basically argues this personal trauma, his father's death, got folded into this anti-government worldview from his mother.
So private grief becomes a kind of public political grievance.
That's how the report frames it. And it links this to how radicalization can start personal crisis, makes you vulnerable to ideologies that seem to explain your anger.
Which brings us to the next big piece the report details. The ideology itself. Christian identity.
A huge influence, according to the report. His mother, Patricia, she converted, and the report lays out the core beliefs she exposed him to.
And these are
Pretty disturbing stuff. White Europeans are the real chosen people. Jews are literally the spawn of Satan. People of color are mud people. Just deeply racist and anti-Semitic.
And the report says this showed up early in Eric.
Frighteningly early. In 9th grade, he reportedly wrote a paper denying the Holocaust, called TV the Electric Jew. Believed abortion was a genocide of the white race.
So even as a young teen, the report suggests connections to these kinds of extremist groups.
Yeah, anti-Semitic, racist, anti-government. It seems to have been there from early on. And this exposure gets way more intense around 1984. He's about 18.
What happened then?
The report details how he and his mother spent time at this Christian identity compound, the Church of Israel, in Shell City, Missouri.
Okay, and there's a key figure there.
Dan Gaiman, founder of the Church of Israel, a big name in the CI movement. The report says Gaiman sort of took Eric under his wing like a father figure, got him into youth programs, gave him literature.
And what was Gaiman teaching him, according to the source?
The report says it was pure CI doctrine. The Bible is Aryan history, Jews are demonic, people of color subhuman, a coming final struggle where aware Aryans have a divine mission. The report points out the Church of Israel is listed as an extremist group pushing white supremacy.
But the report also mentions Rudolph tried to downplay this later.
Yeah, that's interesting. He later denied being a supporter, claimed it was just a brief thing, mentioned being Catholic originally, even said he preferred Nietzsche over the Bible.
So how does the report reconcile that with, say, the FBI's view?
Well, the FBI apparently believes he had a long association with the white supremacist movement, and media reports, books about him, consistently call him a Christian identity extremist. They see his violence as trying to impose this idea of racial and social purity through faith.
So the report kind of questions if his denial was strategic, like distancing himself publicly while still holding those core beliefs.
It leans that way, especially since the report notes he did use biblical quotes and religious language to justify his anti-abortion violence, called it a moral duty.
Let's connect those dots more directly based on the report. How did specific CI beliefs translate into his views and actions?
Okay, so the report draws clear lines. White supremacy, anti-Semitism that links straight to the Holocaust denial, the electric Jew comment, gay men's teachings,
And the anti-government part.
tied back to the family's off-grid lifestyle, the deep suspicion, his later railing against global socialism, calling targets symbols of the regime, agents of Washington.
And the violence.
The report links the CI idea of justified struggle to the FBI's suspected ties to the Army of God, a group okay with violence against abortion clinics, and his own moral duty framing. His intense anti-abortion stance connects to that genocide of the white race idea he expressed early on.
So the report uses this term, genealogy of hate. Explain that concept.
Right. It's like the ideology became this lens, right? It took his personal anger points, his father's death, blamed on the government via the FDA, and channeled them towards these ideological targets. The government itself, global socialism, abortion, homosexuality. It gave his anger a story, a justification, and directed it.
Okay, moving along the timeline the report provides.
Yeah.
After this period, he gets a GED, some college, and then joins the Army.
Yeah, August 1987, basic at Fort Benning, then 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell. Went to Air Assault School too, served about 18 months. There's some note in the report about a rank discrepancy, but the service itself is key.
And his behavior in the military. What does the report say?
This is pretty revealing. He wasn't hiding his views. The report states he openly praised Hitler to fellow soldiers, made anti-Semitic remarks, complained about black drill sergeants. He was apparently isolated, used marijuana, and was reading things like The Little Black Book of Explosives.
Well, so the ideology is still very much active, even in the military. What does the report make of that?
It raises serious questions, right?
Yeah.
It suggests maybe the system wasn't equipped or failed to address this kind of extremism in the ranks. Here's a guy with radical views getting military training, including potentially useful skills like explosives knowledge.
And then he gets discharged.
January 1989, reportedly for marijuana use, only 18 months in. The report identifies this as another major emotional trigger right after his father's death.
So the military experience, the report suggests it didn't moderate him at all.
Quite the opposite in some ways. He gained practical skills, explosives, survival that were later used for terrorism and evasion, and the discharge itself probably just fueled his antisocial feelings, gave him another grievance against the system, and pushed him further down that radical path.
So let's try to bring all these threads together, as the report does. We have the family background, the deep dive into Christian identity, these personal triggers.
Exactly. The report shows how it all layered up. The early environment, the potent ideology, the specific personal blows, father's death, military discharge, they all fed into each other.
And how did the FBI, according to the report, characterize his final ideology?
They apparently saw him as someone who borrowed ideas from different places to create his own personal ideology. Described him as basically anti-everything. Anti-government, anti-abortion, anti-gay.
And his own words, his stated motives, referenced in the report.
Very clear. He said he was fighting global socialism and abortion on demand, which he blamed the U.S. government for allowing. He framed his terrorism primarily as anti-abortion and anti-gay. Remember that genocide of the white race idea about abortion? He explicitly used religious terms, moral duty, biblical justifications.
And the report mentions those long-standing connections to extremist groups and the possible Army of God link again here.
Yes, it reiterates those potential connections, suggesting a network or at least ideological alignment existed well before the bombings.
Does the report see his path fitting any kind of model for how people radicalize?
Yeah, it suggests it aligns pretty well with typical models. You get exposed to an ideology, you feel alienated or wronged, you experience crises or triggers like his father's death, the discharge, and eventually you reach a point where violence seems like the only answer. The report argues his specific triggers fit this pattern perfectly.
And then came the decision point.
Right. The report states that by spring 1995, he made a conscious decision. He was going to embark on a mission, a series of attacks.
And his targets were chosen carefully.
Very deliberately, according to the report. Symbols of the regime, he called them. That meant abortion mills, LGBTQ plus related places, sodomite organizations was his term, left-wing interest groups, and government agents. But abortion, the report stresses, was his main focus.
And the report notes a strategic element, too. He wasn't just acting out.
No, he apparently hoped his bombings would do more, that they'd push other pro-lifers and patriots to move from just talking to taking violent action themselves. The report suggests he saw himself as igniting something bigger.
A catalyst for wider violence.
Exactly. So his case, as laid out in this report, is this stark example of how it all comes together. Personal issues, the surrounding extremist environment, the power of a specific ideology like CI. It really drives home that radicalization is usually this slow burn, this cumulative process.
So reflecting on this deep dive into the report's findings on Rudolph's early years, what does it really tell us? It's this complex picture, isn't it? Family, ideology, personal events all weaving together over years.
Absolutely. It makes it clear that you can't just point to one single thing. It's the interaction between these factors. The CI indoctrination building on the family's anti-government stance, the personal grievances, finding an outlet through the ideology. It's the combination.
And it really underscores that this path to violence, it's often a process, not some sudden snap. These things build on each other, reinforcing a particular worldview.
A worldview where violence eventually seems not just acceptable, but necessary. A moral duty, as he put it, against these perceived symbols of the regime.
So this wasn't just about looking back at one person's history. The report uses this case to show how these foundational pieces can fit together with potentially devastating consequences.
Which leaves us with a question for you, thinking about everything this report lays out. If radicalization really is this interconnected process involving personal issues, ideology, environment, specific triggers, how does understanding that process maybe help us think about preventing it from happening in the first place?
Something to definitely mull over.